The research interest I chose is exploring cultural differences in the use of emotion regulation strategies in post-traumatic stress disorder. It is by Amanda Nagraldin and Laura Jobson. Summary. The summary of the journal tells people suffering with PTSD have emotion regulation difficulties. This study highlights that culture may influence the emotion regulation strategies associated with PTSD. Since culture shapes individual preferences for the strategies used to self-regulate emotions and the psychological outcomes associated with it, two groups, East Asian group and Western group, have comparatively different culture values that influence regulation. For example, in the Western culture, they perceive the self as a unique, independent entity that reflects individual attributes, values, and goals. While in the East Asian group, they define the self in relation to others and following group norms and expectations. Such differences lead to cultural variability in which emotion regulation strategies are either adaptive or maladaptive. Some of the emotion regulation strategies implicated in PTSD include expressive suppression, rumination, worry, experiential avoidance, and reprisal. The two hypotheses of the study was the first one, Caucasians with PTSD will report higher levels of habitual thought suppression, expressive suppression, rumination, worry, experiential avoidance, and general emotion dysregulation, and lower levels of reprisal than Caucasians without PTSD. The second hypothesis states that the difference in the use of expressive suppression, rumination, or worry would be less marked between East Asians with and without PTSD when compared to the differences observed in the Caucasian group. This topic is important to me because in the future I would love to do a study on PTSD and how it affects minorities. The topic is interesting because no research to date has investigated the influence of culture on emotion regulation in the context of PTSD. This table defines the strategies of emotion regulation and the definitions of it. So for example, worry means directing attention towards future-oriented negative outcomes. Rumination is dwelling on one's symptoms of distress and the consequences, and so forth. Details. The details of the study included 69 participants with trauma exposure who were recruited through flyers or on social media. Participants were interviewed using the CAPS-5, which is a 30-item questionnaire corresponding to the diagnosis of PTSD. To assess emotion regulation, they administered a series of gold standard measures such as Emotion Regulation Questionnaire, White Bear Suppression Inventory, and Penn State Worry Questionnaire. All the measures have been used in cross-cultural research and internal consistency was adequate. Participants were also reimbursed with $20 after the study. Data analysis plan. Group characteristics were examined using a series of 2 cultural group East Asian Caucasian times 2 diagnosis of PTSD, no PTSD, with each emotion regulation strategy as a dependent variable. Results. So overall, Caucasians with PTSD scored significantly higher on measures of worry, expressive suppression, rumination, thought suppression, experiential avoidance, and general emotion dysregulation compared to the Caucasians without PTSD. Similarly, East Asian with PTSD scored higher on measures of rumination and experiential avoidance than East Asian without PTSD. However, worry, expressive suppression, thought suppression, and emotion dysregulation did not differentiate between East Asians with and without PTSD. In this table, we see the group characteristics. The mean and standard deviations for group characteristics for demographics and study variables. The 4 groups did not differ significantly in gender or education distribution. In this table, we see emotion regulation, correlation coefficients between the main variables for the overall samples. Problems with the experiment and limitations. Due to the small sample size, it cannot be assumed that these findings are generalized to larger populations. Findings may have been influenced by factors such as assimilation to a different culture since the study was conducted in a Western culture environment. As with all cross-cultural research, language and task understanding must be considered. The study focused on Pacific emotion regulation strategies since there's a bunch of emotion regulation strategies out there. As a cross-sectional study, no causal inferences can be made. And while the two PTSD groups and the two no PTSD groups did not differ significantly in depression, the interaction was significant. Thus, depression may have influenced the findings. These results are important because it supports the findings that immense research conducted with Western populations identifying these emotion regulation strategies as being associated with PTSD. This also suggests the strategies for regulating emotions may differ between East Asian and Caucasian trauma survivors, supporting the claim that culture influences the way in which emotions are perceived and appraised, thereby impacting emotional disorders. Real-world implications. Preliminary findings suggest that there is a need to consider culture backward in the assessment and treatment of emotion regulation in PTSD. The findings also align with emerging cross-cultural research that has identified culture differences in emotion regulation strategies deemed detrimental and associated with poor mental health. The study will be helpful to me in the future because in exploring cross-cultural differences in other disorders as not in just PTSD.